who fought in the revolution and Civil War, oftentimes very courageously. We will touch on the purges more later, but how do you think about the killing off or imprisoning of top Bolshevik leaders? And do you think these actions stemmed from Stalin's scheming regarding how he can gain and consolidate more power for himself, as the mainstream histories often argue? Was it all necessary to protect the revolution, or is the truth more nuanced than either of these options?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, you probably know where we're going to fall on this, but it's more nuanced than either of those declarations. But I think that a couple interesting points is that this idea of the old Bolsheviks, right, is a bit of a fallacy. Because as you'll learn later on when we cover the Purge, as well as, really this entire section, is that just because people fought on the side of the Bolsheviks in the Bolshevik Revolution did not mean that they were communists in the sense of, what we see, or certainly what the Soviet Union saw as socialism, building socialism. Many of them went on to try to reintroduce market reforms. Many of them had their eyes on a social democracy a la France or Germany. That some of them went on to collaborate with literal fascists. So again, the idea that people fought in the Bolshevik Revolution were somehow excluded from criticism or being shitty in any way is a fallacy in itself. Mm-hmm. I think it's also interesting that we talk about, the old Bolsheviks, Zinoviev and Kamenev and Trotsky, who literally plotted sometimes to murder the top leadership of the old Bolsheviks, Stalin, Kirov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Zhdanov. So which side of that coin do you fall on? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And on top of that, what about, the old Bolsheviks, Khrushchev and Mikoyan, who literally set the Soviet Union on the path to capitalist restoration?
Yeah. Or fucking Beria.
Yeah. Or Beria, who was also an old Bolshevik.
He was a hero.
Piece of shit.
He was a hero of World War II, but that didn't mean that he wasn't a shitty fucking human being.
He deserves all the
a
bullets.
Liberal. He was a liberal, basically.
And so, so I think that's how I'm going to fall on that.
Okay. So do you have any thoughts about a sort of paranoia when it came to this perception of constant internal enemies that go on.
I'm going to deflect away until we get to the Purge, because I think without deep diving into it, I'm not going to be able to adequately address what I think was the lack of paranoia for most of Stalin's career.
I will say that here's the thing that I think people forget, is that Stalin was a critic of Stalin. He would, if he did something which he later was like, wow, that was not good, he was able to criticize himself and his own actions. We'll get to that in the Purges, but
consider that question a prelude to the further discussion later.
Absolutely.
So let's go ahead and move on to some myth busting about Stalin. A lot of the stuff that you read about Stalin, and even in, like I say, preparing for this interview, it is almost fucking impossible to find unbiased. I don't even know if it's perhaps being unbiased is impossible in and of itself.
Sure.
But finding information that isn't just racked with ideological prejudice is almost an impossibility here. So it's very tough to sort of get good information on this. So maybe just from the Marxist-Leninist perspective, we can sort of tackle some of these big ideas about Stalin that I think permeate our culture and probably the globe when it comes to the name Stalin. So first, let's maybe discuss the kulaks. Who were they? Okay. How does Western history frame them? And what is the truth regarding them?
Okay, so first let's define what a kulak is. Wikipedia plays this fun game where it says that they were peasants who were wealthy enough to hire other people to work on their farms, and I'm like, that makes them no longer a peasant. A peasant is a particular class. That makes them petty bourgeois at best. So kulak, the name is essentially a class-based slur. which was generated by the Bolsheviks against these individuals. And it translates to fist. But the implication there being that they were tight-fisted. They were greedy, keeping things to themselves. But in order to understand where they came from, you have to actually go back to 1906, to what's known as the Stolypin land reforms. So Stolypin was this, and I apologize, we're probably going to fuck up so many Russian names, Ukrainian names. We're bad at this. So he was the chairman of the Council of Ministers in 1906. And what he was trying to do was basically, he was trying to do a couple of things, but one was to increase the production of agriculture and bring it online with capitalist nations. He was trying to modernize it, but what he was also trying to do was to break up the old school Russian agrarian society. The thing is that the Stolypin land reforms decollectivized the Russian agricultural, basically the landscape altogether. Traditionally, farms were communal in Russia long before the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Soviet Union recollectivized Russian land. So it was under a system known as Obshchina, which literally means commune. They were also known as mir, which can mean a lot of things in Russian, but society is one of them. The same word in Ukrainian is translit, but all across this area, communal farming was the norm. And so Stolypin was breaking that up and turning it into individually owned farming properties. So to that end, they sort of performed what was kind of like the U.S. homesteading. They were like, here, just head out to this land. This will belong to you. You can farm it as you see fit. But what ended up happening, much as the homesteads did here in the U.S., is that particular people had more money, more resources, and were therefore able to hack it better than people who were poor, fewer resources, and so they were able to gather up and collect more land under their own private property, which then cut out the actual peasants in the area. And then, Justin, I think you have something on the situation economically for peasants in relation to kulaks.
Right. So before I get into this, I want to start off by saying that when I was writing notes for this podcast, I made them very stat and quote heavy because normally on our podcast we tend to talk about things anecdotally and conversationally because it's easier to digest and it's more fun for people to listen to. But knowing that this was going to be so heavily scrutinized talking about it, I wanted to, number one, reference a lot of statistics and numbers in order to kind of lay the groundwork for the realities, and also quote a lot of people so that, number one, we have experts, not just me, and also to kind of give personality to the actual conversations that were happening at this time in the Soviet Union. So if it comes off a little dry sometimes, I apologize.
That's fine, yeah.
Anyway, so just for some context, like Jeremy was talking about, in 1928, 3/4 of the land was still sown by hand. And 28 is about when the collectivization efforts started. A third of the crops were harvested by sickle and scythe still. And a quarter of the peasant household had no draft animals or farming implement. And only half of them had plows. So this was still this was still basically all done by hand. Conversely, 4% of the rural population, or the kulaks, owned 15% of the area under crop. And the kulaks, in doing so, were able to accumulate money, not just to live, but to actually save and accumulate money. And what they would do regularly is buy better equipment and then lease it to the poorer peasants. So they became kind of the feudal lords reborn in those areas, because now the peasants needed to try to keep up with the kulaks, who had nice keeping up with the kulaks. It sounds like a sitcom. We should start that. But in order to try to keep up with them, they had to rent equipment to try to harvest quicker. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, they indebted themselves to the kulaks, which just further enriched the kulaks. And at this point, again, the late 20s, when the collectivization starts,
the recollectivization.
Yeah, the recollectivization.
Yeah.
The industrialization efforts in the Soviet Union were well in hand, and all of the major cities were already under, communist control. But 82% of the Soviet population was peasant, and there was almost no party presence in the rural areas at all. So, for example, collectivized agriculture at the beginning brought about 500,000 tons of wheat to market. The kulaks brought 2.13 million tons of wheat to market. And this is at a point at which the USSR is already being threatened with war by the UK, who had just broken diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union and was kind of beating its chest, right? Now, Bukharin, who's a name that you'll hear over and over and over again, at this time, he's Stalin's main ally in the leadership. He stressed the importance of advancing socialism using market reforms. It was kind of his thing. He kind of wanted that social democracy thing. And in 1925, a couple of years before, he called on the peasants to, quote, enrich themselves. He said that we shall move forward at a snail's pace. This is Bukharin again. He's a huge figure. Mm-hmm. And Stalin sent him a letter in response saying, the slogan enrich yourselves is not ours. It is wrong. Our slogan is socialist accumulation. And that kind of shows you, I think, the beginning, and this really was the beginning of the split in Soviet leadership, which you referenced earlier as the imprisonment and murder of old Bolsheviks. In 1928, 1927, the grain harvest is about 4 million tons less than in 1926 due to drought, right? So Stalin had no control over that. The kulaks took advantage of this by basically hoarding the grain and sold it at a 300% markup, okay? And so as a result, the cities start to starve because the communist government can't afford to buy enough grain to support the rapidly industrializing centers of the Soviet Union. And so in January 28, the Politburo unanimously decides to take exceptional measures by seizing wheat from the kulaks and the well-to-do peasants to avoid famine in the cities. Stalin said in October, quote, worker discontent was increasing. There are people in the ranks of our party who are striving, perhaps without themselves realizing it, to adapt our socialist construction to the tastes and needs of the Soviet bourgeoisie, end quote. And Jeremy, you want to talk about the Soviet bourgeoisie? Why is that a relevant statement?
So, are we talking about the kulaks here?
Yeah.
I mean, so essentially the kulaks were... it's such a terrible contradiction because you've got this nation which is nascent, it's just coming into its own, and this drought just sets them back so far. And they did not go out and immediately murder all the kulaks, right? Like, they didn't go out and kill them all and take their stuff and say, this is ours now, right? They were attempting to maintain this sort of peace and trying to keep this mixed economy. But in doing that, they allowed this sort of manipulation of markets to occur because the kulaks had a vested interest in basically banding together as a class to fight against the interests of the peasants and the workers. So they're bourgeois or they're petty bourgeois, and that's all that they are. This is not a large peasant subsistence farming group, as many people will try to frame it later. We're talking about capitalists here,
right?
Who were allowed to continue to exist within the Soviet Union to the detriment of the Soviet Union.
Right. And so in those years, 28 and 29, the communist government has to ration bread and then sugar and then tea and then meat. And so all of these things are starting to kind of fall off the table. And so in 1929, 28, 29, they start these collectivization efforts. And at first, they don't involve the kulaks. It has nothing to do with the kulaks. It has to do with, hey, if you, to the peasants,
If you're a peasant.
if you are a peasant and you get together with other peasants around you and you start this collective farm, the government will give you money, grain, machines. They had tractor stations that people could basically rent, or not rent because they don't have to pay for it, but borrow a tractor to till their land. And they were immediately successful. In 1929, they collectivized agriculture, produced 2.2 million tons of wheat as opposed to the 500,000 they had a couple years earlier. And it was as much as the kulaks had produced in the two previous harvests. In 1930, the collectivized farms would bring 6.6 million tons to the cities. And so now the kulaks are starting to see their way of life, their extravagant way of life, put to death, essentially. They're in their death throes now, okay?
Right.
And not because they're being murdered, just because no longer can they manipulate the markets by holding a greater share of the wheat that's being produced.
Right. And so, just to show you how quickly all of this happened, on January 1st, 1930, 18% of the peasant families were members of a collective farm, a kolkhoz is what they called them. A month later, 31.7%. So almost doubled in 1 month. And it was very largely a youth-led movement, much like it would be in China, as you